exercise is like one of the most robust ways to make every organ system of our body better, and it's just a shame that most people don't really like to do it. It's free and everyone could do it, but not everyone does it enough.
Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Ashley Reaver, and I'm joined by Dr. Gil Blander. Welcome to Longevity by Design, How to Live a Longer, Healthier Life. We're produced by Insight Tracker, your science-based guide to optimizing your body from the inside out. Our guest today is Dr. Brianna Stubbs, who will discuss her work on ketone metabolism for health, performance, and aging. Dr. Stubbs is a world expert in exogenous ketone metabolism and its implications for performance, resilience, and health span. She completed her PhD in metabolic physiology at the University of Oxford, studying the metabolism and the application of exogenous ketone salts and esters. While completing her study, she competed on the British international rowing team and was a two-time world champion lightweight athlete. Brianna is currently Director of Translational Science at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, where she's part of a team focused on developing our understanding of ketone biology, the metabolic effects of novel exogenous ketones, and the translation of these findings into tools for implementation as part of a holistic approach to healthy aging. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. And thanks for coming to the Buck Institute.
Yeah, it's beautiful here, yeah. So, Brianna, it's a pleasure interviewing you. And we would love to hear about your background, specifically about how you decided to become a scientist. And also, I think that you have a very unique background, that you used to be a professional athlete in a way. And I think that that's the first time that we are interviewing someone that is have both of them. So it's I'm sure that it will be interesting for our audience to understand the story.
Yeah, I'll try and give you the 5-minute version rather than the 30-minute version, because get me going and I could talk about this for a little while. But so I was always active growing up. When I was 6, my dad was one of the first people to participate in a transatlantic rowing race. So from Europe over into the Caribbean. So I kind of grew up in this crazy household with all of this adventure and activity, and that was sort of very much a part of my upbringing. And so from an early age, because my dad had rowed, I took up rowing as well. And age 12, I was the youngest person to row across the English Channel and had the world record for some time. So I was all into rowing as a kid. And I kind of progressed up through the junior team into the U23 team. And when I was at college at Oxford I was studying medicine. So I was planning to be a physician. I was training to be on the varsity team as well as on the national team. And I saw this ad to participate in a research study. And they were looking for rowers to do 2K rowing machine tests, which is like kind of the kind of thing that I was doing anyway as part of my training and performance. I was like, I can get paid to do this thing, which normally I suffer through and like my coaches are making me do. So I signed up for the study, and that was a study of how ketone drinks could affect rowing performance. And so it just was super interesting to me because it was really relevant to my passion and hobby of exercise and kind of engaged my science brain a bit. And once I had the opportunity to do a research project as part of my medical training, and so I got in touch with the investigators and asked them if they needed help. And so I was really just like, I was there mopping brows, cleaning up if people were sick, fanning people. I was doing all the like very menial tasks associated with running these kind of studies, and really enjoyed it. And at the same time made the step up, and my results in rowing were really good. And I got invited to be on the senior national team, which was just a huge opportunity. But it also meant that I had more commitments in terms of racing and training, and medical school didn't really fit alongside that. So I asked medical school if they'd give me a sort of sabbatical. And in that time, I also applied for entry into a PhD program, which might not sound like the best idea, but actually a PhD can be kind of more flexible. You set your own schedule, you can choose what kind of experiments you're going to do. And if you have a supportive supervisor and mentor network, then it's more possible than medical school, where I'd have been sent off on placements and needed in lectures and that kind of thing. So then I was successful in getting a place to do my PhD. And because I'd been working in the lab, studying these ketone drinks, that was my topic for my PhD. And they already knew me from my undergraduate project. And so they gave me the space that I needed to pursue both rowing at an international level and then also studying for my PhD, which I did over 3 years. And I won a silver and a gold medal as a senior international lightweight competing for the British team. And yeah, I would never do that period of my life again because it was pretty intense and difficult. But I'm really, really glad that I did it and I kind of pushed through it. And yeah, it changed the course of my life to do my PhD. In the end, I didn't go back and finish medical school. And now I'm a scientist. I really found something that I was interested in. I really felt like it was powerful biology and that it had a lot of potential to make a difference. And yeah, I would not have thought I'd be sitting here talking to you in California, of all places, 5, 10 years, 10 years ago at this point. It's been a while now. I'm getting older, which is maybe why I'm more interested in aging.
And any regrets not becoming a physician?
Only now that I'm trying to do clinical research, there are some things where I need to get in external physicians, and they are busy and expensive, and so it would be nice if I could do some of these things.
Full stack. That in engineering, you're full stack, back-end and front-end, so full stack scientist and clinician.
And it's hard to be an MD, PhD, that's a demanding program. So other than that, I do think that, when I went into in UK, you go into medical school age 18, you don't do pre-med and then medical school. So it was a decision I made kind of early when it just seemed all kind of romantic. And now I see how hard physicians work and the difficulties that there are in that profession. So I think that what I'm doing now has as big, if not maybe even bigger, potential for impact. And so it's trade-offs. I regret it a little bit sometimes, but...
And as a rower, have you been in the Olympic or you haven't had a chance?
Oh, it's a sore point.
Sorry.
No. So I was competing as a lightweight. And in the lightweight category, there's only 2 people who go to the Olympics. And so I was one of the top 4 people in Great Britain and training and always very, very close to being selected for the Olympics. And the year that I won the World Championships in 2016 was the Olympic year. And it was very, very close for selection. And I didn't quite make it. So I won the World Championships, just missed out on the Olympics. And again, I just don't think I could have trained like that for another 4 years. It was really, really hard. And so I'm glad that I took the time when it felt right.
So how do you exercise right now? What do you do for exercise?
Yeah, so I finished rowing and I needed something to scratch the itch that wasn't as demanding as being a world championship level athlete. And so I took up Ironman because that's the obvious thing.
Because it's easy.
Because it's so much easier, yeah. So I did that for 6 years. I was super motivated to qualify for the Ironman World Championships in Kona, Hawaii. And I did that in 2000. I qualified in 2019. No, 20. 19 or 20, and then obviously the pandemic happened and the event was postponed for a while, so I competed in 2022, 2 years ago in Kona, Hawaii, and I came 20th in my age group. And
wow.
Yeah, so I was a pretty decent triathlete. I won the North American Championships in the Ironman.
Yeah, and 20 in your age, you're young, so it's mean that you're very good. It's not like someone in the 80s that have 2 people in
there were quite a lot of people competing. It was awesome. So it took a lot of my endurance background, and I'm really interested in the science of performance. I read a lot, and I'm personally really interested. And so I worked with a really interesting AI-based coaching app that it was super interesting, tweaked my training based on heart rate and load and power. It was it was really fun to experiment with that. It's called Athletica if anyone wants to look it up, but I think there's more people starting to take this approach. And so and also during the pandemic, what were we all doing other than exercising by yourself?
I was baking bread.
Yeah, but we all had our thing, right? I just spent hours and hours on my time trial bike or running
Everyone
around,
and his own hobbies.
Yeah, so I did that. And then honestly, after I competed in Kona, it just felt like the amount of effort I'd have to put in to get the 1% better that it would need to move me from 20th to, say, top 5, something that was actually interesting to me as having been the best in the world previously. It just didn't feel like it would fit around my work, which was getting increasingly demanding and interesting. And I'm married and we bought a house, and just it got to the point where I was like, I've been making so many sacrifices to exercise at this level. I think I just need a bit of a mental break. And so I moved on to another really easy thing of ultramarathon running. And I didn't just enter 50K. I've entered a race that's 240 miles.
Goodness.
That it's a 6-day stage race. So I needed something that scared me. I entered this race and I was like, oh, if I don't train.
Which one is it?
It's called the Dragon's Back, and it runs from North Wales all the way down all the mountains of Wales to South Wales. So it's 50 to 70 kilometers, 30 to 45 miles a day with 12,000 feet of elevation a day. It's a pretty serious endeavor, and I'm not I haven't got a long background as a trail runner, so it's sufficiently scary that it's motivating me to get out there and, do a lot of training and running. So this is my retirement. I'm sort of bouncing from one difficult thing to another.
We have at InstaTracker, we have a lot of customers that actually are ultramarathons and marathoners and Ironmans and all of that. So it's we hear a lot of stories about that.
But it's so important as an athlete to be aware of, your own body. And so I think in that respect, like the blood tracking forms a really important part of that. And especially as a female athlete, right? Hormones and iron levels and all of those things can change. And so if you don't measure it, how can you optimize it? And I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm sure.
Yeah, no, but it's good to say it. It's not everyone understands that it's not only what you're born with, it's also the knowledge and the wisdom and the decision that you make, how to feed yourself, how to exercise.
And I truly think when I was on the rowing team and competing at the highest level, I was not physically the most talented person there, but it's the sum of all of the tiny things that you do day to day in your life that you optimize that will get you that last little bit. I think, isn't there a phrase where it's like hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard? And so I think that if we all put effort into things, you can achieve a lot more than you might otherwise be able to.
I say it a bit differently. They are the talented, that it's 1% of the population, and the rest are the hard worker. Yeah. And I see myself hard worker. I'm not the talented.
Yeah, I was perpetually like third or fourth place at every single like national trial, all the way up through until the end, until you like cross and people see you win the world championships, and they're like, "Oh, great job!" And you're like, "Yeah, there was a lot of near misses to get there."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In your role here now at the Buck, will you explain to us what this new role is? It kind of sounds like somewhat physician dreams almost, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I run along with one of the faculty here, Professor John Newman. He's a physician, so he provides kind of like my safety net and umbrella. It is ultimately like if I muck up, it'll be both of our necks on the chopping block. But operationally, day to day, I'm in charge of helping run clinical research here at the Buck, and it's new and exciting because the Buck was the first place that's freestanding, just focused on aging globally. But until I came along and John and I started working together, we only did what's called basic science research. So we did experiments on worms and on flies and on mice and on cells, and we would take samples from other researchers and analyze them, and we have really unmatched analytical capability to discover new biomarkers and figure out the underlying mechanisms of various age-related conditions. So, it's a very, very cutting-edge place, but we were not doing any human research here. And, it's a daunting thing to go. It's a bit like having a startup where you have nothing other than an idea, and you have to fund. Firstly, you have to get money. You need money before you can start doing anything with an idea. So money, and then, the pieces of the puzzle here that are actually going to make this operation work. And so because my PhD had included a lot of clinical research, I knew and understood what one needed to make a study, to execute a study and to get it from start to finish. But there's no IRB here. There's no clinical research insurance here. We have to set all of this up. There's no structure and governance. We don't have a team. You need to hire people. And that's without having then got the money from a donor to sort of initiate a study. So I've done all of that in the last 18 months, gone from seed funding through to building the infrastructure to allow us to run our first study, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit, that was a 30-person, very small pilot study of ketone esters and aging. And now my pipeline is I have one study running, two studies, one study IRB approved, one study pending IRB approval, one study we've just got another funding secured for, and then two more that are under grant review. So it's really like exponential growth in terms of the research, clinical research that will be happening here. And it's so important because we do have those world-class capabilities. And so for the study, for example, where we're going to look at aging biology in elite athletes, we'll take a muscle biopsy sample downstairs, we'll run it up the stairs, and minutes later it's going to be on the bench of a scientist who's among the best in the world, looking at sexy things like spatial transcriptomics and growing organoids from the muscle and treating it with novel molecules. And so we can really full stack research in a way. And so, no, I'm not a physician. I have physicians cover parts of the protocol that need cover, but sort of operationally sticking together everything from end to end, that's like my secret sauce now.
Yeah, and for the audience, I think that it's great for them to understand how hard is it to run a clinical trial. Yeah. You said 18 months from the moment until you just start the study, then I don't know how long it will take, and then writing the paper might take another 2 years. And so it's something that you started 5 years ago might be published and they can enjoy it just now.
Yeah, I mean, I have work from my PhD. I mean, and that's mainly because people kind of, falls by the wayside a bit. But there's work that I was involved with nearly 10 years ago at this point, which is sort of halted at the publication stage just because the person who was pushing it forward moves on. And so there's a lot of science that kind of gets left on the cutting room floor. But, just to re-emphasize your point, it's like the planning of not only the science of the study, but the logistics of the study, working on all of that, assembling the right team, recruiting for a study can take a while depending on the specific group of people that you're looking for, the ability to kind of get through people. For us, we're not a medical center, so we're recruiting from the community and we can't just pull people's patient records and approach people. So that's a challenge for us as well. And then, right now, I'm also kind of a little bit bottlenecked in terms of data analysis because I've got metabolomics, lipidomics, proteomics, full immune site. I'm drowning in data and I need to sit somewhere in my busy schedule. I need to sit and marinate in it and try and understand it and then write the papers. And then, as you say, I have one paper that went into peer review August last year and it's May now. So it's just okay, and that's on the journal. So yeah, it's a slow, laborious process.
Tough life. And someone from the outside saying, oh, it's so exciting and rosy. And there are a lot of tough moments in the science world. That's something that I would like our audience to understand.
I think one of the funniest things is it's hard to know when to celebrate. When you compete in an Ironman or a rowing event, you cross the line, you're like, yeah, done. At least there's a clear end and a clear reward to, whatever it is. But science, is it when you finish your last patient? Is it when you enroll your last patient? When you finish your last patient? Is it when you submit your first manuscript? Is it when the manuscript gets published? And it's actually kind of hard to figure out when you actually celebrate the wins. And so it's a little bit emotionally draining because it's just you're so exhausted. By the time the paper gets accepted, you're so exhausted. It's just yay.
I feel like it's good to talk about that because people are always like, why don't you have more recommendations on how I can improve this? Yeah. Well, the science has to be there to get it. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of approval, a lot of planning.
Yeah. And science experiments aren't always generalizable to the individual. When you're reading a study or trying to make a recommendation for someone, you have to look at who was in that study. And there's no saying that an intervention which didn't reach statistical significance for a population might not actually be good for that one individual. So I think that, and I hope that, and something that we're working on here at the Buck is bringing big data approaches, and I'm sure you're probably thinking about this at Inside Tracker as well, but bringing big data approaches so that we can actually see if I don't really like the term N of 1 experiments in a science conversation, but truly, if it's working for you, then does it really matter if the peer-reviewed research doesn't add up? The peer-reviewed research is a good place to start, but you have to validate it on yourself as well. And so being able better access to things that close the loop, whether it's wearables or blood tracking or even just subjective feelings, people feel like their skin or their hair is better, they have better energy. That's not to be completely discounted in the real world because science I can't run a study just for this one individual of what's going to work for them. So yeah.
And speaking on which, we brought you here because you are an expert in exogenous ketones, and we would like to start as a background of what are they and what is the difference between them and ketogenic diet, and just a bit of background to, I'm sure it's now in everyone is talking about it, but I'm not sure that everyone understands what does it mean. So let's.
And part of the reason that there's confusion is that companies intentionally conflate things because it's beneficial. So, okay, we'll kind of go from ground zero. So ketone bodies are small molecules that circulate in our blood. They get made in our liver, and the liver uses fat to make them. And so if you're on a ketogenic diet, that would be very low in carbohydrate and very high relatively in fat and typically moderate in protein. But it's the two most important kind of levers in a ketogenic diet, carbohydrate and fat. So carbohydrate intake goes down. That means that your blood insulin goes down. And it also means that your body churns through any stored carbohydrate. So we have carbohydrate stored as glycogen in our muscles and in our liver as well. And so once you've exhausted that, the body starts to mobilize more fat, and that fat gets converted to ketones in the liver. And evolutionarily, this existed because there wasn't a 7-Eleven on every corner. You would have to go periods of time where you couldn't eat food, but our brain is very energy hungry. It's one of the most metabolically active organs in our body, but fat can't fuel the brain. Fat can't get across into the blood-brain barrier, and the brain's really reliant on glucose for energy. And so that's a bit of a problem, given that we only really have maybe 48 hours worth of stored carbohydrate in our muscles and our liver, and that would run out even faster if you're a hunter-gatherer and you go, chasing after an antelope for a 5-hour slow trek. So the brain energy is kind of a bit under threat if we can't get food. And so the ability to turn fat into ketones are able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's a way of taking fat, which can't normally get into the brain, and making it into something that can get into the brain and be this backup energy source for the brain during periods of carbohydrate unavailability. So that would be, as I said, ketogenic diet, but also intermittent fasting, or just fasting, or even starvation, which is kind of involuntary fasting, right? So they evolve for starvation, but we can kind of get our bodies to produce them with anything where we deplete carbohydrate stores. So the key shared thing between the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones is simply the presence of ketones in the blood. If you drink a ketone drink, within 30 minutes, if I pricked your finger, because reading ketones is a very easy little blood test, a bit like a blood sugar test, it would be within 30 minutes, it might be like you'd been fasting for days or maybe even weeks. So they very quickly can increase your ketones, and that means that your body can be burning ketones for fuel. But one of the interesting things about ketones is, other than just being this backup fuel, they can also activate some cellular processes to do with, say, oxidative stress or inflammation, things that we're interested in from an aging perspective. They're called signaling metabolites. So they're fuel and they're a signaling metabolite. And we don't know how much it matters whether the ketones in the blood came from changing your diet or from a drink to get those benefits of ketones as a fuel and a signal. So that's the overlap. The overlap is ketogenic diet or fasting or ketone drinks both increase circulating ketones, and the ketones can be used as a fuel or a signal. Now, the area of confusion, or one of the key areas of confusion, is, do ketone drinks induce weight loss? Because when people go on the ketogenic diet, 90% of the time they're doing it for weight loss. And that in that setting, you'll get losing weight because you're forcing your body to burn that fat and turn it into ketones. And so in that regard, if you're getting these ketones from a bottle, that's not achieving the same endpoint. So that's a really critical, often conflated point. If you were on a ketogenic diet, taking a ketone drink would be like, it wouldn't kick you out of ketosis, but it's still got calories, it's still got energy in it. So it doesn't replicate, especially the weight loss elements of a ketogenic diet. And then the second key element or reason someone might go on the ketogenic diet is to control their blood sugar. And if you had type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, some people refer to it as almost like a carbohydrate intolerance or a carbohydrate allergy. So the idea there is that, your body isn't processing it right, just don't eat it. And so that can help with sugar control. And again, a ketone drink isn't going to do that, because what's helping you in that setting is removing the carbohydrates from your diet. So those are the two key things that ketogenic diets do that ketone drinks definitely don't do. But, I guess then, because I know we're kind of interested in athletic performance here, right? One of those things is, depending on who you talk to, because there's a lot of discussion about this, about whether a ketogenic diet is good for performance or not. In this setting, a ketone drink allows you to kind of strategically drop in ketones as an extra fuel without having to be on that diet. So if you're one of those people where you're like, well, the main argument against ketogenic diet for athletes is that to compete at that very high intensity, you need carbs. So if that would be, if that's what you believe, then you would then be able to follow that regular diet and then also drop in ketones as well. So it allows you kind of flexibility to target ketone intake.
So a few follow-up questions. First, great explanation. I think that you made a very good job explaining it in...
Not my first rodeo.
Yeah, no, that's good, because it's not an easy subject to communicate on. So first about the brain. So the brain can metabolize sugar.
Yeah.
And then you are coming saying, okay, I'll provide him a sugar and a ketone. So what the brain will use at that situation?
That's a great question. So infusion studies is like our best answer for this. And we've shown that as you titrate up the amount of ketones in the blood, glucose utilization kind of go down. So in a healthy brain and in the short term, so, again, like long term, not sure what would happen, the brain can kind of regulate its total energy need by burning either glucose or ketones, depending on how they're available. So you start to get very much into like sort of semantics. And some people like to say that ketones are the preferred energy of the brain because when they're present, they will be burnt. The brain isn't like sentient. It doesn't have a thing that it prefers, right? It will burn whatever's available, and ketone metabolism tends to reduce glucose metabolism. In an unhealthy brain, sometimes glucose metabolism is somewhat compromised. So we see in patients who have cognitive impairment, if you do FDG PET imaging and you put them in a brain scanner, even years before they get any symptoms, you can see that their brain is getting kind of stuck metabolizing glucose, and it creates a brain energy deficit. And there's a research group in Canada headed up by Dr. Stephen Cunane who have been supplementing with ketones in those people with that reduced brain energy metabolism, and they've shown that the ketone metabolism, instead of inhibiting the glucose metabolism, because that was a concern, sort of stacked on top and improved the overall energy status of the brain. So that question is actually really apt because it's always been a concern, well, if ketones slow down glucose metabolism, especially in a less healthy context where glucose metabolism is already a bit less good, would it be worse to then put ketones in and inhibit it further? But that's not what we see so far. It doesn't rule it out, but so far in the brain at least, it looks like if you've got less glucose metabolism, your ketone metabolism will stack on top, whereas in a healthy brain, where you're meeting your full needs, they'll kind of interchange.
And the second question is about athletic performance. So can you explain why exogenous ketone can improve it? What is the rationale?
Okay, so I guess straight up, I'll say that when we started working in this field in 2016, there was really good mechanistic reasons, which I'll talk through as to why we thought ketones would improve performance, but the studies are not consistent anymore. I think one of the hardest things as a scientist is to be flexible and take on, like, you know, as more data comes out, to not just to adjust your viewpoint. Yeah. And I know Peter Attia on his podcast, he like has this question that he asks guests, like, what's one thing that you used to believe to be true and now you don't believe anymore? And I used to be, and this was from personal experience as well, because I was in some of these trials and I felt like ketones benefited my performance. So I used to be like, the mechanisms were really strong. I used to be very, very bullish about this, but like straight up at the top, not all of the studies fall in line. I don't really feel like in good conscience I can be like, everyone should take a ketone. It's definitely going to improve performance. So that's the caveat up front. The mechanistic reasons why we thought that it worked was that glucose metabolism in exercise kind of reaches a maximum threshold. The idea would be that going in with another fuel that goes into the cells and into the mitochondria and into the TCA cycle, this Krebs cycle, by a different pathway that could improve overall energy availability. There was also a very detailed mechanistic and like not super in vitro relevant series of experiments that used an isolated perfused rat heart. So they take the heart out of the body and they give it different substrates, but you can do lots of detailed measurements because it's, you know, very easy to measure system, closed system. And so they did some detailed measurements of this rat heart metabolizing ketones, and they found that the heart was 28% more energy efficient when it was burning ketones. And that figure got thrown around a whole bunch, that like muscles, 28% more efficient. And it's a cool study, it's a cool result, and I believe that it was true, you know, it was a good experiment, but I don't know how relevant that is in a whole system. So that was one area, you know, there was this kind of efficiency that we'd seen in vitro, the extra energy. In the human studies as well, we would see a decreased blood lactate level during exercise. And, you know, blood lactate and the accumulation of blood lactate is one of those things that's associated with exhaustion or having to stop or slow down. And so we felt that potentially that could be contributing to improved performance. The people arguing on the flip side would kind of say that actually that would show that you're blunting your glycolysis, which is that high intensity carbohydrate metabolism. So, you know, I had a few great conversations with Trent Stellingworth, and he was one of the people who looked at the effect of the ketogenic diet on glycolysis. And he felt like you don't want to blunt glycolysis, you need that for high intensity performance. So that point, you could kind of argue either way. Another thing that we had seen in our 2016 study was that the ketone drink spared muscle glycogen. So glycogen in them is our stored carbohydrate in our muscles, and especially if you're doing an Ironman or an ultramarathon or competing in the Tour de France, when you start to run out of glycogen in your muscles, that's also related to exhaustion. And so that was something we felt like if you took a ketone drink at the start and you ran down your glycogen less, then potentially you'd be able to go longer, or you'd have more left in your legs for that sprint, Pogacar versus Vingegaard, in that last, you know, ascent up the mountain. So that was the rationale there. And, you know, that's what our data showed. But again, a few other people have done muscle biopsy studies, and they haven't seen that as starkly as we did, and it might have been because it just comes back to study design. So we, in our studies, did our performance testing with people having fasted overnight, and no athlete's going to go out and do a stage of the Tour de France fasted overnight, and it does change metabolism. So potentially our results were all like true and valid in that experimental paradigm, but then as people started to come along and do studies that were more ecologically valid, it was not replicated as much. So that was another, mechanism we were excited about, and it's sort of back on the discussion table. And then we also saw an increase in burning of lipids that were stored inside the muscle. So we thought that it was ketones were helping the muscle to burn fat as well. And I don't know whether I've ever seen anyone like challenge that data, but also I don't know whether anyone's pursued it. But all of that together, in our 2016 paper, we saw a 4% improvement in 30-minute time trial performance. The rowing study that I was a participant in, it was one of those ones that fell by the cutting room floor, and the data's in a patent but never made it through peer review, and it's kind of a crime, honestly, because it was a lot of work and a lot of sweat and blood by those of us that were in the study.
And a lot of muscle biopsy or not?
Not in that one, thankfully. Just a lot of, there was all, it takes time to recruit these people and run these studies. So that study also did show an improvement. But then groups from Ireland, Brendan Egan's group, groups from they're in the Netherlands, Peter Hespel's group, they started doing like different exercise protocols, running and cycling and sprinting. And I just would say there's not a consensus. No. So again, to go back to what I was saying earlier about like, does it work for you as an individual? At my previous company, we worked with an athlete who used ketones for the 1-hour velodrome cycling attempt. And I think it worked for her. She broke the world record and she felt good on it. So, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say like it definitely doesn't work, but if I put my scientist hat on and I'm transparent about all of the evidence, I think it's like not fully decided yet. So
basically an athlete that listening to us today might our recommendation, I'm trying to see if you agree with me, is we are not sure.
Yes.
And it's you need to decide, but the science is not clear cut.
The science is not clear. I'd encourage, there's strong mechanistic basis and some supportive scientific evidence. So people should try it if they feel like it works for them, try it in a few different situations. I'd say that broadly speaking, those mechanisms play more into endurance sports, prolonging energy availability. And that's why we've seen most athletes using it as a pre-performance, supplement. Yeah. And so try it like that. There's a whole very fast growing field of science that's looking at ketones for recovery. And that's really interesting. And maybe because it's an earlier field, a bit less convoluted and a bit more in agreement. So that's another way that athletes can use ketones, and the mechanisms or the things that are coming up in the literature now. 2 independent groups have found that ketones after exercise can increase your own release of EPO, which is obviously like a huge buzzword in sport. I don't know whether it reaches sort of like clinical significance. There's a difference between reaching statistical significance in a study and clinical significance.
So could be that's why Lance Armstrong
well, I don't know. I was
it drank a lot of exogenous.
He take his blood out and put it back in.
Oh, he did that, but now if you watch a lot of these grand tours, you see the cyclists come over the line and they're just about to give their interview and they get given this bottle, they drink it and they pull a funny face. I'm like 100% sure that's ketones. Yeah. So there's definitely some pro teams still using them, and I imagine that they have really great sports scientists who are running these evaluations. So there's the EPO mechanism. There's a study that's shown an improvement on sleep with sleep quality after really intense exercise. There's a study that's shown that there's a group in Belgium headed up by Peter Hespel, who's also one of the sporting director for one of the teams, and he did a 3-week training study which was meant to mimic the Tour de France, where they really just really hit these people very hard with a lot of training, and the ketone group were better able to maintain the load, and they had fewer biomarkers of stress like cortisol and a hormone called GDF-15, which is associated with stress. So it looked like they were not only performing better, but also physiologically doing better as well. So the people who used to be really excited about performance are now really excited about recovery, and the evidence there is not as mixed. So I'm now also kind of excited to see what happens with the recovery studies as they come out.
But even there, it sounds like it's early days, and it's not like 100% sure that it will work. There are some evidence that it will work.
Yeah, it's like the kind of thing where it's easier to be excited about it because the small amount of evidence that there is more kind of in agreement, as whereas the performance, it's like a little less exciting because there's just so much contradiction in the data.
I want to come back to recovery, but I want to clarify just a few things that you covered so far, just for our listeners, of thinking glycolysis, like why that's needed for high intensity and why a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet potentially isn't the best for that high energy output over a short duration of time.
Okay, so as we're exercising, when you're exercising at a low intensity, our body's got plenty of oxygen, and fat is a fuel that burns, and it can't be burnt without oxygen. It's only burnt with oxygen. And so as you start to exercise harder and harder, if I took you downstairs and put you on the bike and did a ramp test with you, there reaches a point of the intensity where you start to burn less fat and you start to burn more carbohydrate, and there's this point called the crossover point where carb burning and fat burning is equal. And so as your exercise intensity gets harder, there's less oxygen available, and the body has to burn carbohydrate rather than fat. And when you go super hard, so at the very end of your ramp test or your end of your Peloton class and you're like sprinting at 100%, then you're not even able to burn any oxygen that there is there. You're working anaerobically via anaerobic glycolysis. And so anything after the crossover point where you're burning carbohydrate, it's all going through glycolysis, either aerobic respiration after glycolysis or anaerobic respiration. And so especially for that super intense activity, you have to do it using glycolysis. Apart from, say, like a weightlifting snatch or movement, which is done through a different system, which is called the phosphocreatine system. And so that's why creatine supplementation.
Isn't it also for a short sprint?
It's like 9 seconds, I think.
Yeah, so even, I don't know, 50 meter or 100.
100-yard dash.
Yeah.
No, I think 10 seconds
Okay.
is what we can do with our phosphocreatine system, which is why, say Usain Bolt doing the 100, the 200, or the 400 even, that's kind of interesting because he's really using a couple of different energy systems there. And that's why the 800 meters is really interesting because it's like right at the limit of that like anaerobic, not the phosphocreatine, but that anaerobic.
Which
so
is like 2 minutes,
yeah,
roughly, yeah?
Yeah, I think the 800.
2.5 or something.
They can do it in... Can they do it in 1 minute and 40? They go really fast in the 800
They
yard dash.
might, yeah.
Yeah, it's...
Question about the keratin. I sorry that we're jumping, but
It's okay. I don't know whether I'm gonna answer
it's
this,
exciting. But I'm hearing more and more athletes talking about keratin as a supplementation for performance.
Yeah.
Do you know why is it? Why should you take keratin to improve performance?
So, I used creatine as a supplement when I was rowing. We would periodize when we used it. We wouldn't use it all the time. One of the things that people don't like about creatine supplementation is that you can retain water, so you can kind of feel kind of puffy. And for me, like as a weight-restricted athlete, it was, like you'd want to be careful when you were using it. In terms of performance, so it's helping you to get better quality training if you're able to do, I did a lot of weightlifting. If I was better able to do more weight or more reps at a better quality, then that's going to compound the training benefit over time. And I think there's some good evidence around creatine and recovery now, so it's helping you to recover from hard sessions. So it may be slightly improving your performance, but the net effect is going to be compounded by the better quality training that you're able to do. So it's not like if I took a scoop of creatine before I went and did my rowing world championship finals, I'm going to do anything. You have to use it consistently in a training block to get the benefit from supplementing with that. But disclaimer, I'm not an expert in creatine, so if I butchered it, then...
me neither.
No,
so,
I think it's because it's your explosive fuel source, and that's 9 to 10 seconds.
But there's
you have
something
more
else
power
there
behind
as
it.
well
that's what I
around-
also heard, that
I
it's
think
it's
around
more than
recovery.
that, yeah.
And people are really interested in it for recovery from concussion as well.
And suddenly it's becoming in fashion. I heard a lot of people
It's
ask.
been like in fashion with gym bros for a long
Yeah.
time. but,
Yeah.
There's lots and lots of research on it.
Yes,
It came to me. Yeah,
So we just talked about all the energy systems. If you go onto a ketogenic diet, Trent Stellingworth, the scientist that I mentioned earlier, and others have shown that it can downregulate all of the enzymes that are associated with glycolysis. And so, again, this doesn't happen with every athlete that goes on the ketogenic diet. Some athletes can still perform at that very high level, but on average, your kind of ability to sprint at that 10 seconds to 2 minutes, your kind of max power gets blunted because you don't have as many of those enzymes to kind of do that process. So what's really interesting is I feel like the people in this space are fighting about the ketogenic diet and talking about like Olympic level athletes and whether or not it's good or bad. And my position is that for the Olympic level athletes where the intensity is so high and so important, carbohydrates can't really be beaten. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't do periods of lower carbohydrate training to build your like fat burning capacity, all of that, like whatever. There's more nuance to it. And I think that elite athletes are doing more carb periodization, but you probably want carbs for your performance and you want to be carb adapted. But, actually that's only like 0.001% of the population. And what about like for everyone who's aged 30 to 50 running 2 marathons a year or doing an Ironman or, I don't know, just trying to exercise for fitness? If you aren't getting paid because of your performance, then I think the ketogenic diet is probably at least as valid an option as a regular diet. And I think that there are advantages in terms of maybe body weight, body composition, and glucose control. We're in the middle of a metabolic health crisis. And so for some people, they can maintain their performance, maybe even improve their performance if they can improve their body composition. Some people feel like they're less inflamed on a ketogenic diet. So there's nuance to it. I think for Eliud Kipchoge and anyone who's about to compete in the Olympics, like probably not. But, everyone else who's like a weekend warrior and everything in between, then it's on the table still. Not necessarily best. Everything's down to the individual.
Yeah. So I want to, for a second, to talk about ketogenic diet or maybe exogenous ketos supplementation, but not for athletic performance, because our focus, and I assume yours, working at the back, is more about longevity. So I heard you also mentioned that a ketogenic diet can help with maintaining the glucose for diabetic. I heard also there are some papers that show the effect on cancer cells on a specific. So can you provide to us some background about that? Like normal person, and I'm not trying to win the Tour de France, but I want to know what will be my benefit of moving into a ketogenic diet or consuming the exogenous ketos.
As a Longevity by Design podcast listener, you understand the value of improving your health for today and for all the years ahead. And if you want to live your healthiest, longest life possible, you need to understand what's going on inside. At Inside Tracker, we take a personalized approach to health span optimization that eliminates guesswork from your wellness plan. Inside Tracker analyzes blood biomarker and DNA data, along with physiomarker data from fitness trackers like Oura Ring, to deliver personalized food, supplement, lifestyle, and exercise recommendations that allow you to take control and improve your health span. And for a limited time, Longevity by Design listeners can get 20% off at the Inside Tracker store. So if you're ready to receive a personal health analysis and data-driven wellness plan to optimize your body for the long haul, then it's time to start inside. Visit insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today. That's insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today.
So I think that it very much depends on your number one goal. And I think that the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones are really interesting for people who are optimizing for brain health, especially brain health and aging, and then people who already have like a slightly compromised metabolic health, trying to improve that, which then with a waterfall effect is going to improve multiple other aspects of your sort of healthy aging. So let's talk about the brain first. So cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's by some people has been called type 3 diabetes. We're sort of learning that Alzheimer's disease has got a lot of different like subgroups. It's not just like one disease that's the same in everyone, but there's in a lot of people, there's a metabolic component where the brain becomes insulin resistant. And in that case, then the brain, like, as I sort of discussed earlier, is going to be getting energy starved. And so there's a lot of interest in fixing that or helping to mitigate that by lowering carbohydrate intake to stop the progression of insulin resistance, and then also providing ketones as an alternative energy source. So that, if one of my parents was diagnosed with Alzheimer's tomorrow, there's like a very low risk to going on a ketogenic diet, so long as you're doing your Inside Tracker, checking those lipids, because people respond differently, and it's not worth compromising on like your lipid risk factors just for this. But if you, and for some people, they need a little bit of support from a nutritionist to get the right balance of saturated, unsaturated, all of those different types of fats that you're going to be consuming. Like the ketogenic diet, and I should say this like with, like a double asterisk, like is a really powerful metabolic intervention, and it's just as possible to do ketogenic diets badly if you go to the store and you just buy everything that's like keto compliant, like they'll have all these artificial sugar, it's possible to do it badly, but with some support and learning and then self-monitoring and tracking, it's perfectly possible to do it in a way that's delicious, that is not going to affect your lipid markers, and for then the downside is pretty low and the possible upside is, pretty significant.
Caveat, importantly, most people do it the way you said don't do it.
This is
with
the thing.
Cool Whip and Jello
Just like
stuff.
drink.
So they are trying to cut corners and go with
A
the
lot
easy.
of, I think, artificial sugar stuff, which isn't inherently bad on its own, but
It's just too
utilizing
much of
anything.
Yeah.
Just, drinking heavy cream, putting a stick
Right.
of butter in their
The
coffee.
heavy cream, my
Just
goodness.
eating like 6 rashers of bacon for breakfast. Like
Lots
all
of
that's pretty
salami,
satiating, but it's not, there's really good ways to do ketogenic diet and there's less good ways
The
to do
pepperoni and cheddar cheese, like, obsession for snack is what gets me.
Yeah,
Anyway.
there's like companies.
No,
that
it's a good point because
And then people get their blood tested and their lipids are like
5,000.
500 and they're like, anywho.
Yeah.
It's
So-
a common thing that happens to people if they try it.
Yeah. It's because it's hard, we're in the food environment today. It's not only is it kind of a steep learning curve if you decide you're going to go on it and then you're like, oh, I'm going out with friends, like, what can I eat? But you speak to people who have been on the diet for a long time, they've really done a lot of learning and they've attuned to like what they can and can't have, and it becomes sustainable, but it's a steep learning curve and it's very tempting to take shortcuts. So it's definitely a privilege to have access to the type of information and nutrition coaching and support that you might need to do it.
Question to the both of you, because both of you are expert. Is there a place that our audience will find a protocol that sounds more reasonable?
I mean, I collaborate with a scientist called Dr. Jeff Volek, and he's kind of like one of the fathers of he calls it specifically the well-formulated ketogenic diet. And he's written a couple of books that are not thick and are very clear. They have plenty of recipe ideas. They explain some of the science. So it's called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living. And that's a really, very accessible, but I don't imagine the book's expensive. Don't know whether any of that is available on the internet, but I'm trying to think who else would be a good authoritative source of information, who sort of podcasts and stuff. We can think and maybe put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But
I can think the like macro distribution of ketogenic is usually less than 5% carbs, 80% fat, and 20% protein. I think a lot of people also get it wrong that they do 50% carb or 50% fat and 50% protein.
Yeah.
When eating too much protein is also something that can kick you out of ketosis. So.
Yeah, but it depends what the end goal that you're trying to do. Because if you're just trying to lower carbohydrate intake, then that might not be the worst. But if you're trying to get your body to make ketones, then the protein intake also makes a difference. So it takes some learning, it takes some thought. It'd be good for people to either find a good trusted source of information, do some reading, like look at the kind of things that people are eating. It just, you need some inspiration if you're going to try that.
And do you think that they need to measure? It's important to measure the amount of ketones, or it's not important?
So I know the CEO of a company called Keto Mojo who make these handheld ketone meters, and the way he has described it to me is that when someone who is into keto starts, maybe for the first 2 months they'll be measuring daily because they have an app and they can track how people measure. Lots of measuring at the start, and then people they kind of know what's going to work for them or not, and so they actually see a big drop off in how often people measure the longer that they've done the diet. So I think it's a great learning tool. But I understand some people don't like to prick their fingers. You can also use urine dipsticks. That's a less invasive way of doing it, a little less accurate, and not accurate with exogenous ketones. Yeah.
So let's go back to the former question.
Yeah.
So you said that a ketogenic diet can be beneficial for, let's say,
health.
brain health.
Yeah.
We discuss a bit metabolic, correct? Like type 2 diabetes, let's say.
Yeah.
What else is...
What else are the lowest hanging fruit? So in terms of exogenous ketones, to sort of focus in on that a little bit, alongside just the studies that we're running now, which are looking generally at healthy aging and effects on the chronic inflammation of aging and performance with aging, muscle status with aging, that kind of thing. A medical indication that we're really interested in is heart failure. There's a huge body of preclinical literature that uses all kinds of interesting genetic knockouts and all kinds of interesting animal surgery models of heart failure that's shown that ketones can be both protective if they're given before, but also can rescue function if they're given after an insult. So aside from the brain, the heart's it's called a metabolic omnivore, and it's a very avid user of ketones, also got a very high energy demand, and so that kind of makes sense. But, more than that, in terms of it's not just an energy, ketones have been shown to affect inflammation and fibrosis in the heart and some other processes that kind of contribute to the buildup of disease. So there's this great body of science, and it started to move into, again, kind of short-ish term and, fairly isolated. Maybe we're at 5 or 6 clinical studies now that have used mixtures of either intravenous ketones or more recently more of these ketone drinks like I work on. And actually in the last month or so there was a really exciting study that did 14 days, quite a long for a science study, intervention of ketone drinks with people with heart failure, and showed improvements in functional performance of the heart. And so it's still kind of early, but that's something that I think in the next, I don't know how long it'll take to develop a drug, but 5 to 10 years, potentially this biology has been validated from in vivo through to in vitro and now in the clinic. So I think it's potentially, got an impact in certain heart conditions as well. That's very interesting.
And it's because the heart may not be able to utilize glucose as a fuel source anymore?
Potentially, I mean, there's just like a lot of
Or as
metabolic dysregulation, imbalance of glucose and fat metabolism and all of those things. And then, as I said, fibrosis. Ketones also can cause vasodilation, so relaxation of the blood vessels, improve the blood flow to the heart, that kind of thing. It's all, you remember how I listed off a bunch of interesting mechanisms with ketones in sport? We're kind of like that with ketones in the heart. We're like, oh, it kind of does this and it kind of does that and it does this. And nobody in the field actually knows which one's the most important. So, it's a lot of questions still to be answered.
Gotcha.
Around even just like the dose.
Yeah.
Does it need to be high or is it okay if it's low? There's a bunch of people there's a class of drugs called SGLT2 inhibitors, and they're diabetes medications, and they work in diabetes by making you pee out more sugar. But they also trigger the body to make really teeny weeny amounts of ketones, like not as much as if you were on a ketogenic diet, but you just have like a baseline level of more ketones, and those drugs are associated with improved cardiovascular risk or like less cardiovascular risk. And so the presence of ketones has been suggested as one of the reasons why that might work. It's not certain, but there's just multiple lines of evidence and people aren't sure whether it's that low dose is enough or if it needs to be high or what. So lots of questions to answer.
I have 2 questions. We haven't even looked at our list, really. These are all just off
I was skimming it.
Just going back to the brain for a second. For muscle, a way to increase your insulin sensitivity is to use your muscles. Is there anything for those individuals that have lower energy availability in the brain, maybe due to insulin resistance, that can increase their sensitivity to use that glucose in their brain?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can't give you like a clear evidence-based answer. I saw a really great talk by Dr. Tommy Wood, who if you haven't had on your podcast, he's a really great guest, and I'm sure your listeners would enjoy him. He's an expert in brain and muscle metabolism and the interplay between the two. And so he spoke about using the brain and sort of staying cognitively active is an important kind of part of the circle of maintaining cognitive function. And then also the interplay again between the muscles and the brain. And sadly or not sadly, like exercise is like one of the most robust ways to make every organ system of our body better. And it's just a shame that most people don't really like to do it. It's free and everyone could do it, but not everyone does it enough. And so I think that not only staying, mentally active, socially engaged, which are 2 really key parts of healthy aging and that we're interested in here, but also staying physically active and therefore, getting that good muscle and brain interplay is sort of the only thing that we have right now that could help improve insulin and sensitivity in the brain. People have been looking at things like intranasal insulin because going in through the nose would bypass the blood-brain barrier. But that's kind of extreme and probably not going to get to be mainstream. But, yes, it's an important problem. And other than just gold standard advice that we give people already, it's hard to fix.
Interesting. Okay, next question I think is a segue into your research. But in the body, metabolically, if I were to make ketones, there's a few different forms of ketones. Exogenous ketones, I feel like the ones you find in supplements, just because it says it's a type of ketone doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be one that works in your body.
Yeah.
So as an expert, I'm going to hand that question to you.
Yeah. I guess the first really easy one to deal with is there's this whole class of products called raspberry ketones. They don't have the same ketones in them that your body makes, so those are not covered by this discussion at all. They get like smoothed into the ketogenic diet discussion because in a dish at very, very high doses, they increased adipocyte lipolysis. And so it's like, oh, fat burning, oh, keto diet, oh,
It's a Dr. Oz thing, I feel
yeah, it's like kind of smoosh it together. Like, yeah, raspberry ketones, I think I tried to dig into this once. I couldn't find any good like clinical trials. So raspberry ketones, even though they're called ketones, they're kind of like off the table altogether. And so the main classes of ketones that are available in a exogenous ketone product are ketone esters, which is mainly what I focused on in my research, ketone salts, and then, there's more of these types of things being developed all of the time. So there's a class of supplements that are based on a ketogenic alcohol called 1,3-butanediol. That's in a product by Kinetic, a product by HVMN, a product by Real Ketones and Ketone Aid. A number of companies are putting ketogenic alcohols and things, and then also medium chain triglycerides, which would be more like your Dave Asprey bulletproof coffee, like MCT oil kind of approach. So all of these things are things that you can drink, and the goal of those things is to increase your blood ketones in some way or another. So typically the most potent, the thing that gives you the biggest increase in your ketones is this class called the ketone esters. And they're kind of preferred in a lot of settings because they don't have the mineral that salts have, and so you don't have to be watching your intake of sodium and other things across your diet. They're not acids. BHB by itself, BHB, the main ketone body by itself, is an acid, so the ester gets rid of that problem. And so they're kind of more bioavailable. We eat esters all of the time in our food, so we ingest this ketone ester, the ester bond gets broken up, and the components of the ester get released, and then they are either ketones already. So the ketone ester that I worked on during my PhD had one part of beta-hydroxybutyrate, BHB, and one part of the ketogenic alcohol, 1,3-butanediol. And when that got broken up, you'd already have some ketones ready to go, and that ketogenic alcohol would go through the liver, and then the liver metabolizes it into ketones. Some ketone esters have another ketone called acetoacetate in it as well. They're not super common. They taste really, really bad. It depends on the compound, but that one tastes particularly bad. And then here at the Buck, we've been working on a ketone ester that has a fatty acid and the ketogenic alcohol in it. And we're interested in that one because actually, surprisingly, it doesn't directly deliver ketones at all, but it taps into the natural processes of the body to take that fatty acid and metabolize it in the liver, just like you'd metabolize your own fat into ketones. Our hypothesis is that it's going to help train and adapt the liver to make its own ketones because it's going through that same pathway.
Would you have to be like carb deficient in order for your body to produce ketones?
No, so that's the thing with all of these compounds, like pretty much uniformly, regardless of the diet. And actually, a lot of our studies will give the ketones to people along with a big bowl of oatmeal or some like really carb-rich meal to really demonstrate that they're going to have this very potent ketogenic effect. And so if we kind of anchor it on a ketone concentration, if you were fasting for 2 days, you'd be at maybe 0.5, or if you're on the ketogenic diet and you're not very good at it, you'd be like 0.5, just getting into ketosis. And then, the therapeutic range that people are looking at is often between, say, 1 and 3 millimoles, and that's either a very strict ketogenic diet or a very long fast, maybe 7-day fast. You start to get up to 3 millimoles, and these ketone drinks can get you to that sort of 1 to 3 millimole range within 30 minutes. It doesn't last more than a few hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours. Like we had someone in today and he was still elevated after 5 hours. So that's kind of typical, but it's not like if you're making them yourself, you're just going to kind of have like more of a steady level of ketone. So it's sort of, think about it like a Gatorade, but instead of sugar, it's ketones. You're kind of providing that energy for your body, and then it goes down as you burn it or as you excrete it in your breath or in your urine. So the esters have traditionally been really expensive. As more people are making them, the price is coming down, but they do still tend to be more expensive. As I mentioned, different of the esters have different taste profiles. The one that we're working on here, and part of the reason we like it, is it's very, very neutral. And we've had really good adherence to our much longer term studies, much longer than anyone else has done. So the taste varies, but often they can taste quite bad. Like ketones in a nail polish remover, acetone is a ketone.
And that's what you smell.
Yeah, exactly. So it's this very bitter, chemically taste, and so a lot of those ketone ester drinks will taste like that, but not the one that we're working on.
So that's
here.
why diabetic smell like acetone?
Yeah, it's the ketones in the breath.
Yeah.
Have that sort of smell, and sometimes people on the ketogenic diet, if you get too
They
close,
smell the
they
same,
can smell
okay.
as well. So not everyone, but keto breath, it's definitely a thing. So yeah, the esters, expensive, taste bad, but some good, more potent. That's kind of like the key pros and cons of the esters. The salts, as I mentioned, they have this mineral, which not only limits the amount that you can safely take in, but from what we've seen, it doesn't look like as much of them gets absorbed from the gut. Because if you drink like a real salty solution, you just don't balance off the osmotic gradients in your gut so much. So they tend to not only be a little less potent in terms of increasing blood ketones. So the ones that we've seen tend to get you just below 1, between 0.5 and 1. So it's a little bit more blunted. And I would say as well, one thing that people need to pay attention to is like dose. So the salts, you can't take in as much. The esters you could take in maybe up to 12 to 25 grams at a time, and the salt doses tend to be a bit lower in one serving that they'll give you. So it'll be a little blunted. And then in some of my studies, I gave people a lot of ketone salts, and then it caused GI distress because it's like, kind of real salty. It's like with when athletes take bicarb, it's like 50-50 whether it's going to be disaster pants or not. So yeah, thankfully none of our people were exercising, but they were kind of within walking distance of a toilet. But so salts, they're cheaper. They don't have the same problem with taste, but they're less potent and they've got this mineral load. So that's the kind of pros and cons of salts. And then ketogenic alcohols like butanediol, a lot less evidence on those. They're really much newer. They were kind of developed a long time ago. They were being looked at as an alternative fuel for spaceflight, but people moved on from butanediol to ketone esters. Like butanediol was developed and then people were like, this isn't quite what we want, so we're going to make esters of the butanediol. So it's probably as potent as a weak ketone ester, like better than a salt, not as good as a really potent ester. And then I kind of, as my approach to all of these things is you don't want to give too much of any one thing. And the alcohol, depending on the studies that you look at, and this isn't consistently, but it can cause like symptoms of like being drunk. And there's one company, so this is kind of what makes me laugh in this space. You've got a couple of companies selling ketones for performance. I'm not going to name any names here. Some companies sell ketones for performance, but then you've got some ketone companies making like Moscow Mule flavored, like, or beer replacement with the same ingredient. I'm like, well, both can't like be true here. I'm not sure what's true, but that's still like an open question with butanediol. And so or wait to see more research as to like how it works.
Yeah, but we see it also in the supplement. A lot of the supplement that you buy are not what you get. So it's basically Wild West, and nobody know what is the right amount that you have in each supplement.
Yeah, so I mean, butanediol does increase your ketones. It's a little cheaper than an ester. In my opinion, it still tastes pretty bitter and bad, but people are getting better at flavoring it. So it's kind of intermediate, like worse than the salts, but probably a bit better than most ketone esters. And again, intermediate in price. Less science evidence, sort of like TBD, how it's working in the body. And then lastly, medium chain triglycerides. So that's like coconut oil. You can like take in those and they give you like a smaller bump than a salt, or, maybe just equivalent to a salt. Cheap, doesn't have bad taste, but again, a bit of a risk if you overdose that you get GI upset as well. So some people on a ketogenic diet will like supplement or cook in coconut oil or dress with coconut oil because it's sort of the specific fat in there is very easy for the body to convert into ketones.
What about the MCT oil?
That is medium chain triglycerides is the long way of saying MCT.
Okay. And what is the evidence that it's really create ketones?
That's pretty well established, but it's just that lower concentration. Yeah. So one of the biggest open questions in the field is for endpoint X, pretty much any endpoint, what is the dose that you need? Like for athletic performance, people were like, oh, it's got to be quite high. But, as we were discussing for, say, like the heart or the brain, like actually maybe lower levels would be okay. So maybe in the future, MCTs will kind of come back on. And MCTs have been looked at by Nestle and are actually in one of Nestle's like functional medical foods. It's called Brain Expert. And I don't think you can get it in the US, but they did a clinical study of it. And, it helped with cognitive function. And so, it's still a legitimate intervention, but a lot of researchers and consumers, right, if you can take something that gets you to 3 millimoles versus something that gets you to 0.3, people are like, well, more is generally better. So that's kind of why people don't regularly use MCTs. They're just not super powerful.
And those finger sticks are going to pick up any type of all of these different forms of ketones?
Yeah, so all of these forms of ketones will increase your BHB. But that's actually also a great question because so we have 3 ketone bodies that our body itself will make. BHB, which is the one we've talked about a lot, and that is the one that you'll measure on that fingerstick device. Acetoacetate, which I've also mentioned, and it's present depending on your exact physiologic state, it's either a little less than BHB or kind of nearly the same. And so if you took an ester that had acetoacetate in it, or a salt, not common, but something that had acetoacetate in it, you wouldn't be able to measure that as easily using the finger stick because that handheld device is only going to be measuring BHB. And so one of the studies that I have going on right now is measuring all of the ketone bodies in the blood after these different supplements, because we think that actually you've probably underestimated or not really understood the full impact of some of these supplements because you only measure one of the 3 ketone bodies. So the third one is the acetone, which we discussed, which is on the breath. And it's not as clear how breath acetone relates to blood ketone, so it's not a preferred method. And people can also measure ketones in the urine, but again, it varies between individuals. It's not super tightly related to the amount in the blood. So if you can get blood, it's more of a direct measurement of what's going on.
What about digestion? Sorry to pepper you with so many questions.
That's what I'm.
It's not often that we get to talk to someone that actually is an expert in ketones for ketogenics. Ketosis, there we go. For digestion, how does it depend on what it's like bound to that how your body absorbs them?
Well, that's why we think that the esters might be more bioavailable because there's something to do with like the digestion. But so I mentioned that we'd been studying this fatty acid ester here at Buck, and we think that actually taking that with food might help with that digestion of that ester more than others. So the ester that I worked on during my PhD, if I gave it with food, it had like a blunted effect. As whereas the ester that I studied here at Buck, when I gave it with food, it had like a similar or maybe even slightly better effect with food. So not all, I guess the takeaway from this very long response to the question that you had asked me originally about like what's the difference is like they're not all equal. Even within a class like ketone esters, there's going to be differences in how the body uses them and the things that they're good for. And what I hope to inform the community about with some of my research is that, I think that there's going to be different therapeutic indications or different users that are going to benefit from different types of ketone drink and different amounts of ketone drink. I don't think that it's like a one size fits all supplementation strategy. So we've got to understand which one to give, how much of it to give, when to give it, who to give it to, and these are all things that I'm actively working on now at the Buck.
So from what you know today, what kind of population will benefit from a ketogenic diet or from the exogenous ketos as of today?
Yeah, I think the older that you get, the more likely you are to benefit because as you age, your ability to, you get more insulin resistant and your ability to burn and metabolize sugar goes down, and especially in key organs like the brain and the heart. So the risk-benefit ratio starts to sort of like change as you get older. I think for me, like people ask me if I do ketogenic diet and I don't because I'm young, I have, like all of my blood work looks really good. I do a lot of exercise and, I think there's no reason for me to do it. But if I was 30 years older, starting to get into my 60s and my HbA1c was inching up, then like the trade-off is more upside and less downside for me to do that. So I think older, HbA1c is not looking.
So what is the level of A1C that you...
Oh, you're going to put me on the quiz here. I don't know. You'd have to go and like double check on the American diabetes. They have normal pre-diabetes.
Oh yeah, we know. So pre-diabetes is 6.5 is diabetic and 5.7 and above. So someone above...
I was just testing you.
So, okay, you can. So someone above 5.7, if you get into the pre-diabetic, that can be a good treatment for it.
Certainly, at least then lowering your carbohydrate intake.
Yeah.
And, rather than just like go on a diet, think about, okay, can I just not have that like square of chocolate at 10 p.m. or that like scoops of ice cream at 10 p.m. or can I avoid having, because this is, to go back to what I was talking about, my life as an athlete, it can feel kind of overwhelming if you're like, I want to go to the Olympics, or if you're, like, oh, my HbA1c is like 6, I don't want to be diabetic, like what am I going to do? And it's hard to make changes stick if you're just like, okay, I'm going to the gym 5 days a week and now I'm on keto and, and you'll do it for 2 weeks and then you can't maintain it. Behavior change is like the secret sauce, which, you can do all of the biology in the world, and if you can't affect behavior change, then like what good is it? So if people are starting on a journey like this, why not try lower carbohydrate intake first and like stage it out, like identify your weak areas and the things that you think you can like step by step give up and just start there. And so I think that lower carbohydrate intake as a first step, ketogenic, if that's like not giving you the results that you want in terms of your, energy levels or your biomarkers and your output. So keto is fairly far along the spectrum of strength of intervention. So it's not necessary for everyone, but as I said, certain conditions, like you mentioned cancer, and I really don't want to I want to stay in like the safe sandbox here. There's limited studies and obviously a lot of other medical considerations there, but if it was well formulated and you weren't in caloric deficit, you weren't wasting in terms of your muscle, and really like calorie content is the key thing there. So if you can maintain that and maintain your activity level, the preclinical evidence and some of the early clinical evidence, you want to do everything that you can to give yourself a chance. Like it's also like different types of cancers. There's there's more case studies in glioblastoma, for example, that it's like really been helpful. So it's not like, hey, everyone who's got cancer definitely should do this. It's like, do some reading.
So it sounds like it's going back to the brain because maybe
Well,
it's
that's the brain,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I think there's certain other types as well that have been responsive to low carbohydrate. It's any or it works particularly well in cancers that turn really glycolytic because of this whole thing inhibiting glycolysis and starving the tumor of glucose as well. So it mechanistically all makes a lot of sense, but it's it's a hard population to do studies in, and I think there are a lot of studies underway. So but the people who get the diagnosis tomorrow don't want to be told that they should wait for the studies. Yeah. They want to know what they can do now. And it's like, at least with ketogenic diet, it's not like Dr. Oz, take this one magic pill or go to this one, shaman who's up in the hills in Colorado or whatever. Like you're not giving money back to like one man, right? You just change your diet mindfully, sensibly, with some supervision.
And it's tough to stay on ketogenic diet, correct? It's not easy.
I know people who have been on it for years and years and years, and it so just depends. America's not an easy place to be on the ketogenic diet.
Yeah, exactly.
The food environments.
Yeah.
We have very, very people who are 10 times smarter than I am working at Frito-Lay, designing Doritos that are like uniquely sweet and salty, every one that you put in your mouth so that you have to keep eating them. Like you have people whose their whole brain just is on that problem. So we're fighting a difficult battle.
And is there some research about going in and out? Like, do you have to be on ketogenic diet all the time, or can you do like a cycle?
So I think one of the only papers on cyclical ketogenic diet actually came from a mouse study here at the Buck Institute with my mentor, Dr. John Newman, and he found lifespan and health span, so longevity and also functional benefits during aging of putting mice on a cyclical ketogenic diet. And it makes a lot of sense. So there's no clinical study that supports that, but mechanistically, it actually, evolutionarily, we would not have been readily able to access food the whole time. It makes sense that we'd have evolved to go in and out of ketosis in periods of plenty and like lack. So I do think that you maybe, you don't have to take an all or nothing approach. And as I've said a couple of times now, it's like some of good decisions. And not only the ketogenic diet, but Walter Longo, who's down in the Salk Institute, he's done a lot of work on a fasting mimicking diet. Yeah. And they've seen benefits of doing that for 5 days every couple of 6 months or something, like periodic.
And I've seen the company called Prolon.
Walter Longo is the scientist.
Yeah, and I've seen they just published a few papers about it that look pretty good.
I look like, whenever I see Prolon, I'm like, wow, you guys like commercialized eating nothing. Like, good job. Like,
it's like selling,
mastermind level.
Selling ice to the Eskimos in a way.
Like sell you some like seaweed miso soup and like charge hundreds of dollars for it. So I mean, like
nice for them,
But also they are committed to the science, and as you say, they're publishing and it looks good, and but I don't necessarily think you'd have to do Prolon to get that benefit.
No,
fasting
I agree.
So, but it underpins supports the overall idea that cyclical, fairly extreme exposures can trigger reactions that are net beneficial in the long term. So we don't have evidence to support it, but if I had to bet, I would bet that cyclical keto.
But in humans, that cyclical isn't a cheat weekend, probably. Every single week that you finally get into ketosis on Friday just to ruin it, just to try and start it again on Monday.
But if you look at like your blood glucose control over a year, if I put a CGM on you for a year and you did that, and Monday to Friday you ate keto, and the weekends, depending on how off the rails you went, right? Like if you went and ate the whole contents of a donut store, like maybe bad, but like, if you really loved pizza and you had a couple of slices of pizza, or your kid's birthday party and you had a slice of cake, like I think that lifestyle would probably still be net better for your metabolic health than being like, oh, it's too difficult, I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah.
So it's all.
But again, we don't have evidence for that.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think we do.
Okay. So I think that we go to.
I don't even think we asked a single question from our sheet, but thank you.
Yeah. So it was a very educated for us to learn about it, and I assume for our audience, because there is a lot of misinformation about it, and it's good to hear from someone that almost dedicate your life for that research. So it's was very good to hear that. And we usually finish the interview by asking one question about what would you recommend, or what are you doing in order to live better longer? So what will be your...
Can I only have one thing?
You can have two.
Two things.
Have as much as you want.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, so the advice we give anyone when they come here and they ask to the Buck and they ask us what do we need to do, it's diet, so kind of all of the things we've discussed here. But I mean, the simplest thing people can do is like eat less stuff that comes out of a packet.
Yeah.
That's probably just, I'll just leave it at that. So diet, sleep. You know, we all are stressed. We're all looking at our screens right through until like 11 p.m. and I'm guilty of this. But like making sure that you have good quality sleep, that's really important for healthy aging. Exercise, we talked a lot about how much I love to exercise, and I know a lot of people don't do that, but anything is better than nothing. Like 30 minutes of walking 2 or 3 days a week, it's already going to be improving. And especially as you age, doing things like body weight resistance exercise, maybe getting in and out of a chair, holding a backpack, or, you know, depending on your level of ability. Exercise, very, very important, and it's going to determine the level of function that you have as you're aging. So diet, sleep, exercise, and social connection. So, you know, get out into your community, have friends, not just on the internet, like interact with people. Those are the really key things that you can do. And honestly, like, there's no point in even starting to look at supplements until you do those bedrock things right. And so we're not all perfect all of the time. I think the all or nothing mindset's kind of like the enemy of actually getting to where you want to be. So give yourself a bit of grace, try and just stack up more decisions in the good column than the bad column, and just like reset the clock each day. And it's hard to let go of perfectionism, but perfectionism is hard on the soul.
Sure.
Yeah, and we couldn't agree more. That's what we believe at Inside Tracker. So it sounds like we are thinking the same line. So thank you so much, and appreciate you hosting us in your wonderful institute. Absolutely. And we hope that we'll have time to tour your lab and see how it's look like. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by Inside Tracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out, using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit insidetracker.com/podcast.